Hi there, Smart Drivers. Rick with Smart Drive Test talking to you today about the Second World War and the technological advances that we now today enjoy because of the Second World War and the improvements in mechanization as a result of the war. Yes, the war was absolutely horrible, no doubt about it, but out of war comes many advances that we enjoy today. So this is another part of the story. I think we're on day 27 of lockdown. Stick around. We'll be right back with that information. That story, actually. Not information. Story. Hi there, Smart Drivers. Rick with Smart Drive Test. Eric is here, and it is 50 to 60 degrees in Minnesota, Minneapolis, there in Minnesota. Yes, Farron is here from South Africa. Ryan is here from Regina, Saskatchewan. So if you're tuning in or you're watching on the replay, let us know where you are in the world. And Farron, war creates jobs. That is very true. That is very, very true, Farron. And in the United States of America, it is commonly referred to as the military-industrial complex that creates a lot of money, a lot of jobs, and a lot of people rely on it. So Carrie is here from not able to talk here. My tongue is not working. From Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota. There we go. I finally got it out. And Carrie sent me the bridge that collapsed. What year was that, Carrie, that the bridge collapsed there? I actually posted it on the Smart Driver community tab. I don't know whether I posted it on the actual open Facebook page or not, but what happened was, and this is what we were talking about yesterday in terms of being in the hands of engineers. We showed you the Washington Narrows. My brain is not engaged with my mouth this morning. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge that collapsed in 1940 due to the wind, and engineers had miscalculated the wind getting a hold of it like a sail and making it, work like a swing, and it collapsed. So Carrie posted the picture of the bridge on the I-5? One of the interstate bridges, and it collapsed. 2007 it collapsed. Thanks, Carrie. Collapsed, and they had determined after the investigation that the gusset plates are when the reinforced steel underneath, and it's on an angle like this, and it goes like this and this and this. So that bit, and there's a plate that goes on at the joint to secure it to the deck beam. And what happened was the gusset plate was supposed to be an inch thick, and it was only half an inch thick. And as well, what happened was the bridge had been failing for a very long time, 17 reports year after year after year. All of the reports said that the bridge was failing and needed to be replaced. And, as I say, nothing is one reason why things happen or things fail. And what happened with the bridge was that construction crews were doing work on the bridge in 2007. They piled 300 tons, which is the equivalent of 12 tractor trailers, on one weak point on the bridge where the gusset plate had actually failed and it was beginning to buckle. And with rush hour traffic over the bridge collapsed. And this was the other thing that I was talking to you about yesterday is that, it's not just engineers who are sometimes to blame when these structures fail. It's also the responsibility of governments. And I mean, we have changed this quite a bit in terms of inspections and those types of things. But the building of the structure, whether it's a bridge or, another part of the road system or whatnot, goes out to tender. It goes out to the lowest bidder. So there's a fundamental conflict in the way that the work happens. And the way that the work happens is the work goes out to the construction company, and the construction company's goal is to do the least amount of work for the most amount of money, whereas the government or the authority that's hiring the construction company to build the structure wants the most amount of work for the least amount of money. So you have a fundamental conflict there. And I have heard stories, and I've told you this yesterday, that the Westgate Bridge in Melbourne, Australia collapsed during construction because they had been using faulty materials. And there was inspections were not happening at a frequency that they should have been happening, and the bridge collapsed. And I would argue, I would put forward that the same thing happened here with this bridge. I mean, the bridge lasted 40 years. So how are you going to go back and say to the construction company, oh, you cut corners on this? I mean, they did the same thing on the Brooklyn Bridge. Watch the making of the Brooklyn Bridge. They did the same thing with the cables. That the company supplying the materials are supplying substandard materials. And I would argue that that's what happened with the bridge in Minnesota is that these construction companies who are the lowest bidder to build the bridge cut corners on it, and somebody, I don't know whether it was malicious or not, or they didn't know whether it was malicious, but sometimes it is malicious. And I hear stories about this more than I would like to hear those stories. And I've talked to building inspectors, and building inspectors say, they can't be there all the time to inspect the work that's being done. And this is very true in terms of the work being done. In terms of the investigation, it was 40 years later that the bridge collapsed. They can't go back to the construction crew because maybe even the construction crew or the people responsible aren't even there anymore. So, unfortunately this happens. Jonathan, my friend, is here from New York. Farron, this is why I always say engineers need to be on site every day. The materials need to be checked. Miscalculations and errors really show themselves in the real world. Absolutely, Farron. I absolutely agree. Carrie, the 35W bridge, it is a huge freeway bridge that goes over the Mississippi River. Still remember the shock of seeing that bridge go down. And yes, and it's something that's going to be remembered for a very long time in the consciousness of the Minnesota people, the people who live in Minnesota, Minneapolis. You can go there and you can talk to people and they will tell you about that. Okay. Eric, sounds like it's cost over quality of the job. And Eric, sometimes it can be. It very much can be, and the mistakes of that. And going back to what Farron is saying is that engineers need to be on the job site every day. They need to be inspecting and those types of things. And and I'll just, for anybody who is a homeowner or planning on owning a house, and you hire general contractor, you hire a contractor to do renovations on your house, it's the same thing. You as the homeowner better show up every day to make sure that the work that you believe is going to get done is actually going to get done. Because you need to have oversight on these people who are doing the work. Because the people are, my mom called me this morning. We had eavesdrops put on her house. And, there was one of the downspouts on the back of the house that went down into a drain. Well, they didn't even put it down onto a drain, back into the drain, the same downspout. And you're like, oh, come on, people. Really? Now you got to fight with them to get it done after the fact. I mean, if you haven't paid them, then you have leverage. But otherwise, and it's the same thing for house renovations. Here's, that fundamental conflict between the people doing the work and the people paying for the work. The people paying for the work, just to repeat what I said before, the people paying for the work want the most amount of work for the least amount of money. The people doing the work and getting paid want to do the least amount of work for the most amount of money. So, so here's an example. And this happens more than you'd like to think. When you hire a painter to paint your house, say the inside of the house, for example, you want 3 coats on new drywall. 3 coats of paint on new drywall. You want a coat of primer, and you want 2 coats of paint at minimum. Because, now that we have these environmental standards in terms of paint, some of the stuff that they've put in paint will not allow paint to cover the way it used to. So, what painters do is that they will tint the primer. They will put a coat of primer on and they'll put a coat of paint on, and they'll save themselves huge amounts of money. But you don't know, because you come in and you say the room painted. How do you know that you've got a coat of primer and 2 coats of paint unless you came in and watched them do it? You don't know. So you need to be there for oversight. And it's the same thing with these jobs, that are being done and whatnot. Now, public infrastructure jobs and those types of things are being done completely different than they used to be done years ago. Governments used to fund them and those types of things, and it was taken out of taxpayers' dollars. It's completely done differently now. These huge corporations, conglomerates, they fund and pay for the project, and then over 20 or 30 years, they get paid back. So, for example, the Port Mann Bridge that just got built in Vancouver, for every vehicle that goes over, the company gets paid a certain amount of money. Same thing with the bridge here in Kelowna that got built, when was that, 08? same thing. So, okay. So we got kind of way on that. Let's go back and talk about the transition from horse-drawn traffic to mechanized traffic, and we'll kind of talk about the First World War. So I talked about the Industrial Revolution, which kind of happened at the beginning of the 19th century, the two inventions that really changed the world in which we live. The invention of the steam engine and the invention of the telegraph. And those, of course, there were many, many other inventions that came out of that, as the 19th century went along and we turned into the 20th century and we came to the First World War. And I would argue that the First World War was the culmination of antiquated military techniques. The whole army charging into the fray and facing off against another army. And what happened in the First World War is you had all of these technological advances. We basically had mechanized killing by the First World War, but the military techniques had not caught up with it. And this is why the First World War was so absolutely devastating in terms of 20 million lives lost. This was completely unprecedented in terms of wars up until this point in the First World War. Farron, my mother hired an engineer to help with her house. He just gave the workers his plans and left. The workers are completely lost. I wish engineers here were only paid after the project is complete. Yeah, that's problematic for sure. Cougar, the Aikashi Kyoyo Bridge, I'm not saying that right, longest suspension bridge in the world, cost of construction, $3.6 billion. That's an insane amount of money. 10 lanes. And Cougar, the same thing with the Burj Dubai Tower in the Middle East. $1 billion it cost to build that building. I mean, these are just incredible. How long is that bridge? You said it's 10 lanes, but how long is it from span to span? All right. Cougar obviously has some challenges with the Portman Bridge in Vancouver, and of course another oversight that was made, they didn't realize that the cables on the Portman Bridge were going to ice up. But the same thing would happen, Cougar, with any suspension bridge, that there would be icing of the cables that could potentially drop down onto the deck. So, but I mean, they fixed that now. They have those rings that they drop down so that they can de-ice the cables on the cables on the bridge, rather. Carrie, there is memorial to that bridge today, and there are LED lights on the new 35 bridge that light up at night. This for special reasons on that bridge. Light up blue for healthcare workers. Awesome. That's really great. All right, so many inventions came about during the First World War. And Europeans, you have to understand that the First World War was not really a world war. The Americans were involved, but the Americans were involved only in the last few months of the war. They were not involved for the whole war, and it was very much European countries and their colonies, because you have to understand that there was another kind of surge of colonies at the end of the 19th century for many of the European countries. For England, France, Belgium, Germany, all of these, they all had colonies around the world, and these were the people that were involved in the European war. So technological advances that made the First World War so devastating was, first of all, artillery. Artillery shells could now be accurate beyond a mile, places you couldn't see, which was unheard of in any war prior to that. And there's a very old video clip from the First World War where the cavalry is riding across an open field. They cannot see any of the enemy troops, within sight, and the artillery shells come in and bomb the cavalry. And this is completely unheard of. And this is the reason why we get trench warfare in the First World War. The other thing is the Europeans, you have to understand, were the superpower. The United States of America did not become a world superpower until after the Second World War, the mid-20th century. The Europeans were a world superpower, and the United States of America, until the end of the Second World War, was political backwater. Nobody paid attention to the United States of America. Had the Europeans paid attention to the Civil War in the United States in 1860 to 1865, the Europeans would have seen the writing on the wall. They would have seen the fact that they were embarking on a trench warfare. If you look at the Battle of Atlanta and March to the Sea and some of the battles that happened at the end of the Civil War, it was trench warfare. That's what it was. I mean, they were dug in and they were experiencing trench warfare. So some of the inventions that made the First World War so devastating were, tanks, mechanized transport, trains, barbed wire, bicycles, photography, bullets, single cartridge bullets. I mean, not so much photography, obviously didn't have it, but it did allow them to begin to document the war. Rifles that were much more accurate over a much longer distance. The fact that you didn't have, the old muskets that you had to, put powder in and paper and all that stuff in the bullet and whatnot. Actually, you just had a bullet that was the full thing that you could just put into a gun. You also had machine guns, which, military had some difficulty integrating into warfare and those types of things. So there were a lot of inventions, and probably one of the most important revolutions that happened during the First World War was standardized time zones, which came about in 1912. It was a Canadian thing. Fleming introduced standardized time zones in the world, because you have to realize that before standardized time zones and before everybody had clocks, there was a clock in the Times Square, and most people, told time by the clock in the Times Square if that worked. And then where was I going with this? Times. Yes, most people worked on the sun coming up, the sun going down, and seasons of the year and those types of things. So now what happened with standardized time zones and, the perfection of time during the First World War, you were now be able to coordinate attacks. I mean, yes, we only had the Navy and we only had, the Army in the First World War. The Air Force was in its infancy with some airplanes and those types of things in the First World War, but it was really about Army and Navy, and you were able to begin to coordinate this thing. Not only were you able to coordinate that, but you were also able to coordinate railways. And railways were the other major influence in the First World War, because now you could transport enormous numbers of troops. You could transport enormous numbers of logistics and supplies to the front line, which previously couldn't have happened with horse and wagon, those types of things. So now, you have huge numbers of troops, huge numbers of supplies, and logistics, the movement of services and goods to supply the front line are now, this becomes another science in the military in and of itself. So these are things that all happen in the First World War. And then we move on to the Second World War, and we begin to see this stuff being perfected. And now in the Second World War, we have the addition of the Air Force, and mechanization of the Air Force has now been improved and perfected. And, dropping bombs and dogfights and those types of things. All of this happens during the Second World War. Cougar. Cougar, you have a real issue with this ice thing. And how many times a year does it ice? Once or twice, maybe? It doesn't get that cold in Vancouver. Most of the time it rains. Total length of the longest bridge in the world is almost 4 kilometers. Total cost of the Port Mann Bridge was $3.3 billion. No, that's not right. That is not right, Cougar. It cannot be $3.3 billion. $3.3 billion is a crazy amount of money. It's got to be a different amount of money. That just doesn't sound right to me at all. Okay? And like I said, I think you're overplaying the icing problem on the Port Mann Bridge. Like I said, it only happens once or twice a year. Okay? So we come into the Second World War, and so what happens before the Second World War? As many of you know, we have the 1920s, and then we have the Great Depression that happens in the 1930s. Many of the roads, and we were talking about engineering and roads and bridges and those types of things yesterday, many of the roads and road projects got built during during the Great Depression, because these were kind of make work projects that the government was putting out there to try and put people to work. The Golden Gate Bridge, for example, was finished in 1937. It was very much a work project of the Great Depression. It was authorities trying to put people back to work and have these make work projects. The Great Ocean Road, the Great Ocean Road in Australia was another make-work project that they built along, the ocean, obviously, the Great Ocean Road between Melbourne and Adelaide. And you can drive that road. It's an incredible drive. Unfortunately, it's one of those roads that's very narrow, windy, twisty road, and motorcycle riders like to go out there. And, unfortunately, there's a few places that, there's a motorcycle death almost every week on that road. So that happens there in Australia. And there were many, many other places in the world, many other projects that got done during the Great Depression because of governments and authorities trying to put people back to work. So we, in a sense, those of us who became motorists later in the middle of the 20th century benefited from those make-work projects, the building of bridges, the buildings of roads, and whatnot that happened as a result of the Depression. Now, much of this mechanization became perfected in the Second World War, and not only that, but I would argue that the Second World War also pushed forward the transition from horse-drawn traffic to motor traffic. And you could probably write a paper, a dissertation on this and argue that and say that perhaps the transition from horse-drawn traffic to motor traffic may not have happened as quickly as it did had it not been for the First World War and the Second World War, because you have to understand that the infrastructure for horses was centuries old. Livery stables, the crews of kids and people who were cleaning up manure on streets, the getting rid of manure, putting manure onto crops and fields, and those types of things. The making of wagons, the making of bridles, and all of the tack that is required for horses, veterinarians, people who have specialty in training horses, all of this stuff. You have to understand that there was an enormous infrastructure built around the horse as the primary mode of transportation. And even as many benefits as the motor car had, that it didn't have to be exercised every day, that it only required fuel when you were using it. You could leave it parked indefinitely. Just endless benefits to the motor car. I mean, and the fact that it traveled faster, it took up less space. The huge number of benefits. It still took the better part of 80 years to transition fully from when the motor car first appeared to when the last horses went off the roadway. So it took a very long time to transition from horse-drawn traffic to motor traffic, even though the motor traffic had enormous numbers of benefits. So we come into the Second World War, and as I said, we didn't have the Air Force. We did have the Air Force in its infancy in the First World War, but in the Second World War, we bring on the Air Force. We have Army and Navy, and we have the coordination of all of this, and we have enormous numbers of troops now. And the United States of America comes into the war in 1942. You need, and most of us if you have kind of limited knowledge about the Second World War, you know a lot about what's going on in Europe. You know about the war in Russia, the Blitzkrieg with the Germans and those types of things. You need to understand that Japan had invaded China and was fully involved in an invasion well by 1937, 1938. The war of Japan against China was already well underway. So there's also that aspect of the war as well, and the Japanese kind of, move that and make the arena of war bigger and bigger by invading Hawaii in 1942, the day of infamy, whatnot. And this is what brings the United States of America into the war. So, as Farron said, war creates jobs, war creates industry, war creates profit, and you have the war front, but you also have the homeland. What is going on in the homeland, right? The building of machines, the buildings of tanks, the buildings of munitions, transportation, jeeps, all of the mechanization that goes into building war. And the United States of America, as one of the countries in the world where the theater of war was not happening, they profited from this incredibly. Not only did the United States of America profit from this, but they also went on to become one of the superpowers in the world as a result of the Second World War. Because as historians say, not one building was bombed on United States soil other than, the attack on Pearl Harbor. On the continental United States, there was no damage. There was no, reconstruction after the war. And one could also argue that Europe stopped being the superpower that it was before the Second World War because, parts of Europe were completely and utterly destroyed. I mean, Rotterdam, for example, they've said, Rotterdam wasn't just bombed. It was completely annihilated into smithereens. There was literally nothing left except dust. Okay, so that's what happened in Europe and whatnot, and huge advances in mechanization and those types of things, and I'll sort of talk about that a little bit. Carrie, during World War II, there were a lot of people working in factories to support the troops, making parts for machines to support the war effort. Yes, absolutely. Cougar, sorry to interrupt. I searched cost of Port Mann Bridge. It was built by Australian firm, and according to Globe and Mail, it costed $3.3 billion. That, Cougar, that just, I don't know, that seems a lot. I'll have a look, but suspension bridges, as Bill Wright, carry less of an environmental footprint, aesthetic burden, and are safer. Yeah, we're not disputing that, Cougar. Not disputing that. There were a few bombings on the west coast of the United States. Yeah, a few, but minimal, absolutely minimal, Hallface, compared to what was going on in continental Europe. So, going back to Carrie's point, the number of people working in factories to support the troops and those types of things, excuse me, what happened was, because all of the men were being shipped off to war, what was happening on the home fronts and who was coming into factories to build munitions and build machines and those types of things that were required for the war effort was mostly women. Okay? Women were the reserve labor forces for factories and those types of things during the Second World War. Not only were women brought into factories to run factories and those types of things and to work in the factories, women were also enlisted in the military for support roles within in the military itself. And there is this charge that women after the Second World War, many women who had been enlisted in the military and those types of things, left the military en masse and simply went back to the home and voluntarily went back to the suburbs and those types of things. You need to understand, and this is the reason for the thumbnail about the greatest generation, is that women had been postponing families for a very long time. So most of the women by the end of the Second World War who had been enlisted in the Second World War had worked in factories and those types of things. The Great Depression, and I talked about the 1920s, there was only kind of 3 or 4 years in the 1920s that was kind of prosperous, and then by 1928 the Depression hits, and so from 1928 till the end of the Second World War, which is 1945, we're talking 17 years. We're talking almost 2 decades by the end of the Second World War, and many of these women, many of the men, had postponed getting married. They had postponed getting a family, or having a family, having children, and those types of things. And women and men together were very excited about the opportunity of the Great Depression being over. They were very excited about the opportunity that the war was over, and willingly went back to having some semblance of normalcy. I mean, we can kind of talk about that now in terms of the lockdown and whatnot. But, this was even crazier in terms of, international events that were going on, the fact that there was a devastating European war, the fact that most people, their lives have been completely in upheaval and those types of things. So it was not a surprise that people wanted some sense of normalcy, and that people went back to the homes and went back to work and kind of took on those kind of stereotypical roles that we kind of think of grandpa and grandma having, that the wife stayed at home and had children and looked after the children and tended to the house and those types of things, whereas the men went out to work and whatnot. The other thing that happened after the end of the Second World War is that governments had learned from the First World War and knew that they had to create all kinds of programs to infuse money into the economy so that there wouldn't be a massive depression or recession as there was after the First World War. And this is what they did, and allowed a lot of people to kind of go back to school and get retraining and those types of things and have jobs. And this is the reason why the baby boomer generation, those born after the Second World War, became the richest generation in history, because there were plenty of opportunities to rebuild the economy and whatnot. So, not really getting to my point today about technological advances that happened because of the First World War, or the Second World War rather. You have to understand that things need to be built better during times of emergency, during times of war, because if you have a Jeep, for example, that is used for transportation, and the Jeep is unreliable and breaks down on the side of the road, first of all, you're in the theater of war. You could be killed by enemy fire. So, A, you don't want the Jeep to break down. B, if the Jeep does break down, you need to get parts, replacement parts to fix that Jeep, or you have to abandon it. You don't want to have to abandon it because that costs a lot of money. And the third thing is that the Jeep has to be easily to be fixed. Can we fix it, right? With some sort of common knowledge, right? Not common knowledge, but can we train people to easily to repair Jeeps and to fix them and those types of things. So you need to think about all these things when you're driving vehicles in the war. Can it be fixed by the people who are operating and driving that piece of machinery, whether it's a Jeep or a tank or an airplane or whatever it is, right? How much training do you have to have in place to keep that vehicle maintained, to keep that vehicle going and making sure that it's going to be able to do the job that it's going to do? Because you have to get replacement parts out, you have to get people to fix it and those types of things. And, it's only been kind of in the last 20, 25 years that automotive technology, or technology of machines, has advanced to such a degree that we can no longer fix them. I mean, up until, the 1980s, 1990s, most people who drove vehicles were fixing them on the weekend. They had a garage in the back and they had a box of tools and they were fixing stuff and those types of things. That's not so much the case anymore with, advances in automotive technology and the reliability of it and those types of things. So the war forced engineers, mechanics, and those types of things to build better machines, to build better tanks, build better airplanes, build better vehicles, because they had to be reliable in the theater of war, because if they weren't reliable in the theater of war, people got killed, and as well, it cost money because, if you left the vehicle there, you come back and it probably wasn't going to be there when you got back because it was either bombed, burned, or the enemy had taken it, fixed it, and taken it. So this is all the things that happen. Epic, my friend, how are you? Requires backup cameras in all the new made cars that has to do with child safety transportation. What is backup cameras in cars nowadays do to ensure that kids can be visibly seen? Oh, okay, I understand what that is. I'm not sure whether that's going to see you, Farron, the only reason Americans managed to get into space was because they feared losing the space race to Russians. Competition and urgency really does bring out the best of people. Yes, it does. And Farron, we could have a whole other discussion about Sputnik and missiles and technological advances of missiles, because it was really rockets and missiles. You're talking about the space race here. Once Sputnik went into orbit, and Americans could see the satellite going around, then they were very much afraid of the Russians' ability to perfect rockets and to launch satellites into space. And I mean, of course, all of this hinges on the Cold War and the launching of nuclear missiles and those types of things. And of course, I just finished watching Dark Fate, the latest in the, Terminator apocalyptic movie. Quite good if you get a chance to watch it. So lots going on there. And backup cameras, yes. Backup cameras, again, implemented in vehicles because of fear of running over children in driveways. And I'm really, I don't understand how that happens. I do understand how it happens. I understand that children are running around and crazy and all those kinds of things and got lots of energy, but you really need to be training children from a very young age that motor vehicles are dangerous, and never, ever, ever trust a driver of a motor vehicle. And even as adults, I cannot stress that enough. Never, ever trust a car when you're on a bicycle, when you're on a motorcycle, when you're walking. I've been in the last year, I've been almost run over twice. One night I was walking down the street, and I'm at an intersection, a T intersection. I'm right on the right side of the road. I'm almost up on the curb. It's the wintertime. There's a snowbank there. And this person came around the corner making a left-hand turn at the T intersection and just completely cut the corner right off and nearly, missed me by like a foot. And I was like, oh my God, really? This is what we're at in terms of people driving? So, if you're out walking around or driving, or you've got kids running around or those types of things, then you need to be aware. Cougar, I hate turning around. Backup cameras are a godsend. Well, Cougar, I'm sorry to say, but you're a bad driver if you're not turning around and looking out the back windshield. You should be looking around the back windshield. The backup camera is not a means of backing up safely. There are so many things you can't see. Oh my God. And just, I can't even, it just makes me angry when I hear that kind of stuff. It's like I see people all the time. I walk through parking lots and grocery stores and I see them backing up with the mirrors. They're not looking out the back window where something is going to be. Okay, I'm off my soapbox now. Backup cameras are good. There's no doubt about it. They're good. But they should not be your sole method of backing up. You should be using your mirrors. You should be looking out the back window. I can't. I still prefer looking out the back. I don't rely on backup cameras. Exactly. The backup camera is another thing that can help you back up safely, but it should not be used as your primary method of backing up. You should be looking out the window. And I'm sorry if you are... Jonathan, backup cameras are nice here in New York. Can't use them on a road test. No, you can't. There's the only state that I'm aware of that you can use backup cameras is New Jersey. Otherwise, you can't. They should simply be an addition to your ability to be able to look out the back window, but you should not be using them as your primary method of backing up. And that's why most of the states, provinces, and places in the world do not let you use backup cameras. It's the same thing as using mirrors. Yes, you should be able to use your mirrors, but in addition to proper observation techniques. And the number one reason that people get into backing crashes is because they back the vehicle up, put it in motion before they look. And I'm serious. Next time you go grocery shopping at the grocery store, just walk up and down the aisles of cars and watch people back up. You'll see them all the time. In reverse, the car is moving. Oh, yeah, okay, and they're looking in their mirrors. And this is particularly people who are veteran drivers who are just looking in their mirrors. They're just like backing up, looking in their mirrors, not checking their blind spots, not doing a 360-degree scan, blah, 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 all the rest of it. So, Janet says use your mirrors. Eric, blind spots too. Look over your shoulder. Yes, you got to do that 360-degree scan around your vehicle. And it's the same thing. Pre-trip inspections, they're not just for commercial vehicles. Pre-trip inspections are for people in passenger vehicles too. And it's always a good idea, if you've left your vehicle parked for a little bit, come back, walk around the vehicle. You don't have to be inspecting and looking at stuff and those types of things. Just have a quick boo to see whether there's something underneath the vehicle, whether one of the tires is flat or you got a broken light or something like that. It doesn't take any time out of your day. You don't have to do a big inspection. And I say this to commercial drivers when I'm teaching them, when you go away, go in and have a cup of coffee, you walk back out, and while you're walking out, you're looking at your vehicle. You're taking note of your vehicle. Has anything changed? The pre-trip inspection happens over the course of the day. All right. Carrie, agree we need to train kids about the dangers of cars. Still remember how upset my dad was with me as a little kid once for not looking both ways once before crossing the street. Yes, Carrie. I've had a couple of episodes with my daughter, particularly my daughter, not so much my son, but my daughter, just kind of like wandering out into the road and not looking. And the other thing, Carrie and the rest of the smart drivers that are here, teaching kids about sound, especially when you're walking. Sound is so important for identifying vehicles that are approaching and those types of things. Sound, I would argue that sound is actually more important than looking. So when you teach kids, and if you have kids or you're going to have kids and whatnot, when they come up to the corner, the intersection, or those types of things, look, listen. Can you hear anything, right? It's so important. Epic. Jonathan, it's different in New Jersey because you're allowed to use them if your road test was taken after 2016, in addition to parking sensors. Yeah, don't agree with that bill in New Jersey. Farron, the backup cameras can break, so knowing how to park and move the vehicle without it is also important. And here's one for you, Farron, and I'll have to look this up. They passed a law somewhere in the United States. I don't know whether it's there or not, but they said that they could replace cameras or replace the mirrors, the side mirrors, with cameras. And I'm like, where's the backup? What happens if the camera fails? It's exactly what Farron said. What happens if the camera fails? Then what? You don't have any mirrors? You don't have a backup? Where's the backup, right? It's like the movie Serenity, right? When they're crashing at the end. Where's the backup? Janet, you were so right, Rick. When I walk through parking lots, I'm always watching brake lights, backup lights, because people put it in reverse and just go way too often. All the time, Janet. Absolutely. No, I totally agree with that. And, that's another thing that you can teach people is that when you're walking through the parking lot from the grocery store back to your car, watch the other cars and watch the reverse lights. Everybody, you should know what reverse lights are. If you don't know already, on the back of the car, there's a white light that will come on when the vehicle goes into reverse. For commercial drivers, you'll know that you have reverse lights because you should be checking it as part of your pre-trip inspection. However, those reverse lights come on and you know that vehicle is going to back up. And most of the time, not always, but sometimes you can also hear the driver drop the transmission into reverse because most of them will make a bit of a clunk. And if you listen, you can hear it going into reverse as well. So listen, look, and see those reverse lights coming on, and then make sure you don't stand out in front of them. Eric, not totally rely on mirrors, even blind spot mirrors. Look all around all the time, scanning while you drive too. Yes, Eric, 360-degree scan, absolutely. Farron, glad I will not have kids. I cannot take care of other people. Nope. I used to think that way too, Farron, until I had kids. And oh yeah, when they say you have to teach children everything, I knew that it was everything, but I didn't realize it was everything in capital letters, in quotations. Everything. How to wipe their bum. how to spread butter on a piece of toast and whatnot. So it's great fun. Michael, I noticed that some of these newer vehicles, their white lights, they have white lights while they're sitting in park. Oh, I've never seen that, Michael, but if you get one of the brands or models of the vehicles, send that to me. I'd be interested in knowing the reason for that, why they're in park. Unless you're talking about... No, because even the daylight running lights shouldn't come on until the vehicle actually goes into gear. So, yeah. All right, so there we go. We'll leave that there for today. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the interstate system in the United States of America. And, and we'll definitely talk about road systems as a result of the Cold War. So, all right, so all the best. Have a great day. And remember, pick the best answer, not necessarily the right answer. Bye now.